I'm going to tell you how this ends before I tell you how it began, because if I don't, I'm not sure I can get through the telling of it. 6 hours after the worst morning of my life, I was sitting on the floor of a church hallway on the north side of Chicago, my back against cold plaster, smelling candle wax and old stone, and the particular exhaustion that only comes when your body finally believes the danger has passed. Thomas was asleep against my shoulder, 11 years old and heavier than I remembered, or maybe I was just weaker than I used to be. Catherine was holding my hand, not squeezing it, just holding it, the way you hold something you came close to losing. None of us could stand any more, so we didn't. We just sat there on the floor of a church we'd never been inside before and never needed to be inside again. I've closed a lot of cases, saved people I didn't know, lost people I should have saved. But this was the one that showed me what I was actually made of, and I didn't always like what I saw. I woke at 5 in the morning the way you wake when something is wrong before you know what it is. The bed beside me was cold, not recently empty, cold, the way sheets go when a person has been gone for hours. I called for Catherine, no answer. Called for Thomas. The house held the sound like a jar holds still air. I went downstairs and the kitchen was the way it always was, except for the thing on the table that wasn't supposed to be there. A chessboard mid-game, the pieces arranged with deliberate care, and a note folded underneath the white king. I read it once, read it again. The handwriting was precise, unhurried. Good morning, Mahoney. I have your queen and your knight. 2 locations, one of you, 12 hours. Choose carefully. Below his initial, just the letter H, 2 addresses and a key taped flat against the paper. I stood there in my undershirt in the cold kitchen reading that note, and my hands were doing the thing they do under pressure, the trembling I never talk about, and I let them tremble for exactly 30 seconds. Then I got dressed. Charcoal wool coat, the one Eleanor, Catherine, gave me. I put on the coat and I read the addresses again. My first instinct was the telephone. The black receiver was in my hand before I'd thought about picking it up, the way your body runs ahead of your mind when the thing you're afraid of finally arrives. Pryor's number was in my head. Vasquez's exchange was in my head. Every siren I could summon was in my head. And then I read the note again. The line I'd skipped the first time, tucked at the bottom below the addresses like a postscript, like an afterthought that was anything but. Every siren buys them 1 less hour. I stood with the receiver pressed against my ear and the line buzzing, and I thought about what kind of man writes that sentence. A man who has thought this through longer than I've been aware of it. A man who has planned for the obvious moves, the reflex moves, the moves made from panic. I put the phone down. I did not call Pryor. I did not call Vasquez. I did not call anyone. I stood in the kitchen with the receiver back in its cradle and the chessboard watching me from the table, and I understood for the first time in 40 years of this work what it felt like to be completely alone inside a case. Then I picked up the key and went to my car. The first address was a building in Pilsen. 4 stories, industrial brick gone dark with decades of soot, the kind of structure that used to make something and now just stood there remembering. I drove past it twice before I parked. There were signs, the careful kind, the kind only a cop trained to read them would catch. A window on the 3rd floor with the glass slightly fogged from interior warmth against the cold outside air. A door at the side entrance that had been recently oiled. No rust stain on the concrete below the hinges. Someone was inside that building. Someone was being kept there. I sat in my car and looked at my watch and then at the second address on the note, and I ran the mathematics that made me sick to run. Pilsen to the second location. 40 minutes in light traffic. Longer in morning congestion. By the time I'd entered and cleared this building, I'd have no time to act on what I found at the other, and Crane knew that. He'd known it when he chose these 2 addresses. He was sitting somewhere watching the clock the same as me, and he already knew which way I'd jump, which meant I had to not jump that way. I started the car. Crane was a methodical man. I'd spent months learning the shape of his thinking, and the shape of his thinking was always the same. He arranged situations so that the obvious answer was the wrong one, so that the faster you moved, the more ground you lost. The first address was obvious. It was warmer, closer, showed signs of occupation. It was designed to be found. It was designed to be chosen. That's the thing about a chess player. Every piece on the board is positioned with intention, including the ones that look like gifts. I drove west through the gray morning, hands on the wheel, the shaking in them bad enough that I gripped harder just to feel like I had control of something. I ran scenarios the way Pryor and I used to run them across a diner table, except there was no Pryor here and no diner table, just me and 40 years of casework and 2 addresses and the understanding that I was already inside someone else's game. I'd accepted that. What I hadn't accepted was losing. The second address was near the rail yards, cold storage country. I thought about Thomas, 11 years old. Wherever he was, he'd been there since before I woke, and he was his mother's son as much as mine, which meant he was scared and quiet about it. I drove faster. The cold storage facility near the rail yard smelled of iron and refrigerant and the particular dead air quality of a building that processes things and moves on. The key from Crane's note opened a side door I wouldn't have noticed otherwise. It was painted the same gray as the surrounding wall. No handle on the outside. Inside, a corridor, then a stairwell, then a row of freezer rooms with heavy latched doors, the temperature dropping with each step. The third room on the left. I heard him before I opened it, not crying, not calling out, just a faint sound of breathing, measured and careful, the way a child breathes when he's decided to be brave about something. I opened the door. Thomas was sitting on an upturned crate in the center of the room, knees together, hands folded, wearing his coat and his school cap, looking at me with Eleanor's eyes. Not dangerously cold in there, cold enough to be frightening for a child. He'd been there since 3 a.m. I crossed the room and held him, and I counted to 10 in my head because 10 seconds was all I could afford to give both of us. And then I told him what I needed him to do. I told Thomas to get into the back seat and lie flat and not raise his head no matter what he heard. I told him the doors would be locked and I had the only key. I told him his mother was fine and I was going to get her. I said these things in the voice I used for facts, not for comfort, because he was my son, and he could tell the difference, and I needed him to trust the facts right now, not be managed by the comfort. He nodded once, which was exactly what I would have done. I locked the car doors. I stood on the sidewalk by the rail yards in the pale early light, listening to the freight lines and the distant city grinding itself awake, and I understood with the cold clarity that fear sometimes delivers that I was leaving my 11-year-old son alone in a locked car on a Chicago street while I went into a building that may or may not contain my wife and certainly contained whoever Crane had watching the place. This was the hardest thing I had done in 40 years of hard things. I knew it as I did it. I filed it under the category of things I would reckon with later. I checked my watch. 7 hours left. I drove to Pilsen. I stopped at a red light on Halstead, and the windshield wiper on the driver's side caught something on its return sweep, a folded paper tucked beneath the blade. I got out in traffic, horns behind me, and took it. Sat back behind the wheel and read it while the light turned green and nobody moved and somebody leaned on their horn hard enough to be personal about it. You found the night first. Interesting. I expected you to go for the Queen. Maybe you know me better than I thought. The H again, the same precise hand. I put the paper on the passenger seat and I looked in my mirrors with the particular systematic attention of a man who has surveilled people for 4 decades. Nothing conclusive. A gray sedan 2 cars back that had been 2 cars back since the rail yards. Could be coincidence. In my experience, coincidence is what lazy detectives call patterns they haven't finished reading yet. He'd been behind me since Thomas. He knew I'd found Thomas. He knew which choice I'd made, and he'd watched me make it. I thought about what that meant for the end game. If Crane had wanted to disrupt what I was doing, he'd had every opportunity. He hadn't. He was still running the board. He was still, somehow, enjoying this. That was the thing about Crane that made him different from every other dangerous man I'd encountered. He wasn't trying to win. He was trying to play. The Pilsen building was a maze dressed as a building. I'd noted it on the drive-by, but the inside confirmed it. The ground floor had been partially gutted and restructured, corridors leading to doors that opened onto other corridors, stairwells that didn't connect to what logic said they should. It had the feeling of something deliberately altered, not for storage or industry, for navigation, for the specific purpose of slowing down a man who needed to move fast. I climbed to the second floor, then the third, reading the building the way you read a city block, not room by room, but as a whole shape, looking for the logic underneath the obstruction. And then I found the trail. It was deliberate. I knew that even as I followed it, which made it both a gift and a provocation. A button from Eleanor's camel hair coat lying in the center of a third-floor corridor, placed, not dropped. 30 feet further, a lipstick mark on the wall at shoulder height. Not a smear, but a shape, almost like an arrow. She'd been conscious. She'd been aware enough to leave these. Whatever else Crane had done or hadn't done, Eleanor had been alert enough to fight back in the only way available to her. That meant something. I kept moving. The room at the end of the third-floor corridor was unlocked. The door swung open on silence, no creak, hinges recently oiled, the same as the building's entrance, everything prepared. I saw her from the doorway. The coat first, camel hair, her coat, the one she'd worn to church last month and complained was too heavy for the season. She was tied to a chair, blindfolded, her posture the particular stillness of someone who'd been there long enough to stop fighting the restraints. I said her name. She didn't respond. I crossed the room in 4 steps and touched her shoulder, and my hand went through the coat like it was nothing, because it was nothing, because it was fabric over a wire frame, a mannequin wearing my wife's coat, my wife's scarf, her actual scarf that still carried a suggestion of her perfume, which is how I knew the rage that came up in me wasn't just professional. A recording clicked on somewhere in the room, a device I hadn't spotted. Crane's voice, unhurried, almost regretful. "She's not here, Mahoney. I moved her when you chose wrong." I stood in that room with my hands shaking badly now, worse than they'd been all morning, and I breathed, and I checked my coat pockets. In my left coat pocket, something hard and small that hadn't been there when I dressed that morning. A chess piece, the Black King, Crane's piece, the one you lay down when the game is over. In my right pocket, a folded note, same hand, same precision, different message. A third address, further north, and below it, "I'm tired of watching. Let's finish this face-to-face." And then a line that I read 3 times, because the first 2 times I wasn't sure I was reading it right. "You've played well, Mahoney. Better than anyone I've given this game to. What comes next isn't a trap. It's an ending. I need you to believe that." I stood in that room with a mannequin in my wife's clothing and a chess king in my hand, and I thought about whether I believed it. I decided it didn't matter whether I believed it. I was going anyway. The only variable I had any control over was time, and I had less of it than I wanted. I pocketed the chess piece and the note and went back down through the maze of that building, faster now, less careful, because whatever Crane had waiting for me at the third address, it was the last address, and my wife was there, and I was out of patience for this particular game. Thomas was exactly where I'd left him, lying flat in the back seat, coat pulled up, cap pulled down. When I unlocked the door and looked in, he looked back at me the same way he had in the freezer room, measuring, contained, working hard at something internal that most adults don't manage. I told him the truth because he'd earned it and because he'd know the difference if I didn't. I said, "Your mother isn't at the place I just came from. I know where she is. I'm going there now." I told him there was a man who had been directing all of this, and I was going to meet him, and it was going to be all right. He looked at me with Eleanor's eyes for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "Is she scared?" And I said, "Probably. But she left me a trail to follow. Your mother is the smartest person I've ever worked a problem with." He absorbed that, nodded once the way he'd nodded at the car instructions. I started driving north, and I didn't look in the rearview mirror at him, because if I had, I might not have kept going, and I had to keep going. The chess king was in my coat pocket. I could feel it against my ribs every time I breathed. The church on the north side was closed for renovation, scaffolding on the west face, a canvas barrier across the main entrance that moved aside if you knew to look for the gap. The inside was dark except for candles, votives, dozens of them, placed along the pew ends and the sill of every window, their light making the space feel ancient and deliberate and staged, which is exactly what it was. A chessboard on one of the front pews, pieces arranged. I'd taken about 6 steps down the center aisle when he stood. He'd been sitting in the front row with his back to me, and he stood the way a man stands when company he's been expecting finally arrives. He turned around. I'd only seen Crane at distance before, surveillance photographs, a description built from other people's accounts. In person he was unremarkable in every way except the stillness. He looked at me. Then he looked past me at the windows facing the street. He said, "You brought the boy." The note said not to. I realized then what I'd been too focused to calculate. From where Crane was standing, with the candles behind him and the darkness of the nave between him and the windows, he had a clear line of sight to where I'd parked the car. Crane wasn't what I expected, and he was exactly what I expected, which is the particular quality of a man who has been thinking about you while you've been thinking about him. He was calm, well-dressed, a good coat, wool, expensive, the kind of coat that means a man considers himself worth dressing well. He spoke without theatrics, which made him harder to read than a man who performs. He told me the game had never been about harm, not to Eleanor, not to Thomas, not ultimately to me. He said he'd spent years in a particular kind of loneliness, and that what he'd been looking for was someone who could meet him on the board, who could read the moves and not panic, who had the discipline to think while the personal stakes were highest. He said he believed I was that person and that the last 12 hours had confirmed it. He said all of this the way a man states a business case. And then he said, "But you broke a rule. You left the boy in the car. I told you not to involve him beyond the finding. Now I have to recalculate the ending." He wasn't threatening. That was almost worse. He was genuinely working through a problem. He pulled a gun, not with urgency, the way you produce a logical next step. Held it low. His hand was steady in the way that made my unsteady hands feel like a confession I'd been making to every criminal I'd ever faced. I didn't reach for mine. I stood in the candle-lit church aisle, and I looked at him, and I said what I knew to be true because the truth was the only play I had. You've never killed anyone who didn't already have a heart condition. I said it flat, like a record of fact. 4 years of cases, and the coroner's notes say the same thing every time. Elevated risk, pre-existing, the push that trips an already failing system. You've never put a bullet in anyone. You've never put a hand on anyone that left a mark. I said, "You're not going to start with a child." The gun didn't lower, but it didn't fire. His eyes moved over me the way a man's eyes move over a calculation he's checking for error. I kept talking. Not to fill the silence, not to perform negotiation, because I was right, and being right clearly and specifically is the only kind of argument that works on a man who operates on precision. I could see him listening. I could see him weighing. So I kept going. While I talked, I was also doing something else. I was describing the church. I did it in the body of what I was saying to Crane, woven through it the way a man will narrate his surroundings when he's cataloging a scene, which Crane would recognize as professional habit and not flag as unusual. I said, "This is a good location. The nave runs east-west. The candles make the east end bright and the west end a blind spot. You chose the front pew, which puts the altar at your back and 30 feet of open aisle between you and the entrance." I said, "There are windows on the south wall, 4 of them. The second one from the entrance is the one with the clearest view of the street." I wasn't talking to Crane. Or rather, I was talking to Crane, and I was also talking to my son, who I had left the car window cracked open for before I entered the building, the gap wide enough to carry a voice clearly across a quiet north side street in the early morning. Thomas was 11 years old. He was scared and brave, and his mother's son as much as mine. I was describing the room to him as precisely as I could, and I was trusting him to do whatever he did with it. I don't know exactly what Thomas did in the minute or two he spent outside that car. What I know is what I heard. Sirens, distant at first, then directional, then closing. 8 minutes out, maybe less. The sound of Chicago police moving toward a specific address on the north side at speed. Crane heard it at the same time I did, possibly a fraction before me because he was listening for disruption the way a chess player watches his opponent's hands. He looked toward the south windows, then at me. There was a long beat in which the candlelight moved and the sirens moved, and neither of us moved. Thomas had not called them because I'd told him to. I hadn't told him to. I had told him to stay in the car. What I'd done instead was describe the room clearly enough and trust him with enough of the truth of the situation that he'd made the decision himself. I hadn't given him an instruction. I'd given him information and trusted him to be the person I knew he was. He was 11 years old, and he had made the correct call under pressure without anyone holding his hand. And if I survived the next 8 minutes, I intended to tell him that. Crane looked at me for a long time after the sirens clarified their direction, not with anger, with something more like recalibration. He said, "You didn't call them. Not a question. An assessment." I said, "No, I didn't." He said, "The boy." I said, "The boy." He absorbed that. I watched something move through his expression that I've thought about many times since. Not quite admiration, not quite defeat. Something closer to the recognition one player extends to another when the board resolves in an unexpected direction. He looked at the gun in his hand as though seeing it from a new angle. Then he lowered it. He said, "She's in the sacristy. Back of the church, south side. Door is locked from outside on a bolt." He said it the way a man closes a transaction, clearly and without drama. I said thank you, which is not what I expected to say, and I meant it, which surprised me more. I left him standing in the candlelight, and I moved toward the altar at a run, which was the first time I'd run in this whole 12 hours, and the running felt like something releasing. The sacristy door was on a simple external bolt, old iron, and I had it open in under 4 seconds. Eleanor was inside, tied to a chair, actually tied, not a mannequin, not a trick, blindfolded, and she said my name before I got the blindfold off, which means she heard my footsteps and knew them. 40 years of my footsteps, which is the kind of thing that goes into a part of you and stays. She was shaking, not with cold, with the particular physiological aftermath of hours of controlled fear releasing all at once. She was furious, at Crane, at the situation, at me, in the way you're furious at someone when your fear for them converts to anger the moment the danger passes. She said, "You left Thomas in the car." I said, "Thomas called the police." There was a pause. She said, "Of course he did." When the officers came through 20 minutes later, Crane was still in the front pew, gun on the floor in front of him, hands visible, not running. When they cuffed him, he looked at me across the length of that church, through all that candlelight and all that distance, and he said one word, "Checkmate." I didn't answer. There was nothing to answer. The paramedics wanted to take all 3 of us somewhere warm and flat and professional, and eventually we'd let them. But not before the 3 of us had spent some time on the floor of the church hallway in the way I told you at the beginning. The plaster was cold, and the stone floor was cold, and none of it mattered. Thomas fell asleep in stages the way kids do when the adrenaline drains. First still, then heavy, then gone. Eleanor didn't sleep. She held my hand and stared at the ceiling the way I was staring at the ceiling, and I don't know what she was counting, but I was counting my decisions. The one to go to the second address first. The one to take Thomas with me instead of leaving him with a neighbor. The one to leave the car window cracked. The one to describe the church room out loud. Some of them I'd make the same. Some of them I'd make differently, and I knew it. And I sat with that knowledge the way you sit with things you can't undo. At some point, Eleanor said, "You found my button." I said, "And the lipstick mark." She said, "I wasn't sure you would." I said, 40 years of practice." She almost laughed. Almost. It was enough. 6 weeks later, Crane in custody, Stateville processing his paperwork, a trial date 4 months out. The city moved on the way Chicago always moves on, under its own weight and noise, the lake cold and gray, the stockyards running, The elevated trains carrying the same faces to the same places. First morning back, I hung the charcoal coat on my office hook and found a letter on my desk. Prison postmark. Crane's handwriting on the envelope, precise as always. Inside, a single sheet, one line of chess notation at the top, a queen's gambit opening move, whites first, and below it, whenever you're ready for the next game. I'll be here. I read it twice, folded it and put it in the bottom drawer of my desk, under the Briggs file and the Wabash warehouse photographs and the other things I keep, because forgetting them entirely would be its own kind of failure. Then I looked out at Chicago in the early morning gray, the city doing what it does. Pryor was at his desk. Vasquez's light was on. I picked up my coffee, which was already going cold. Gotta work. That's all there is to it in the end. You survive what tries to take everything from you, and then you pick up the cold coffee and you get back to work.